The national debt just crossed $39 trillion. The country is borrowing $7 billion every single day. Interest payments alone will eat over $1 trillion this year, which is more than we spend on national defense. Social Security is 6 years from insolvency. When it runs out, the law triggers an automatic 24% benefit cut for every retiree in the country. The typical working American has less than $1,000 saved for retirement. 80% of older adult households are either financially struggling or on the edge. Half the country is living paycheck to paycheck. 27% of Americans have zero emergency savings. 59% cannot cover a $1,000 emergency expense. 88 million adults say they are struggling or in crisis with their finances right now, and nobody in a position of power is talking about what happens next. I am going to tell you what happens next, not what the politicians are saying, not what the media is framing, what the data says, what the economists are warning, what the numbers show when you line them all up and stop pretending they are not connected. Because everything I just told you is not a list of separate problems. It is one problem. It is a system that is failing at every level, from the federal budget to your kitchen table, and the people who are supposed to fix it are either too afraid to say it out loud or too bought to care. Cut to title card. Nobody wants to say what happens next, then back to camera. 2 days ago, the chairman of the Federal Reserve stood in front of 400 Harvard students and said, and I am paraphrasing only slightly, that the fiscal trajectory of the United States will not end well if we do not do something fairly soon. That is not me being dramatic. That is Jerome Powell, the most powerful financial official in the world, standing in a college classroom, warning students that the country they are about to inherit is on a path that, in his words, is not sustainable. The Penn-Wharton budget model, run by one of the most respected fiscal economists on the planet, says the real debt is not $39 trillion. It is closer to $100 trillion when you include the obligations the government has already committed to but has not funded. And their model estimates that within 20 years, the Treasury may not be able to roll over its own debt. That is not a recession. That is not a downturn. That is a sovereign debt crisis in the richest country in the history of civilization. And the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that Congress just passed will add another $4.7 trillion to the debt over the next decade. The CBO called the short-term economic boost from that law a sugar high. Their words, not mine. Meanwhile, 771,000 Americans were counted homeless on a single night in January 2024, a 33% increase since 2020. The median home now costs over $400,000. You need an income of $126,700 to afford the monthly payment on an average home, and the median household income is $80,000. Child poverty was cut in half in 2021 when Congress expanded the child tax credit. They proved it worked, and then they let it expire, and poverty surged right back up. Then they passed a new tax law that sends 41% of child tax credit benefits to the richest fifth of families and virtually zero to the poorest fifth. 99% of children in the poorest households are excluded. They cut SNAP so deeply that Feeding America says it will take nearly 6 billion meals off the table every year. And they cut $863 billion from Medicaid, which will strip coverage from over 10 million people by 2034. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for Americans aged 10 to 34. 1 in 5 high school students seriously considered attempting it last year. Trust in the federal government is at 17%. Trust in media is at 28%. Trust in Congress is at 10%. Only 3 institutions in the entire country still have majority confidence from the public. 3 out of 18. This is not a political video. I do not care who you voted for. I care about whether you can afford to eat next month. I care about whether your kids are going to inherit a country that works or one that has already been hollowed out by the time they are old enough to understand what happened. What I am about to walk you through are the 10 clearest signs that the American system is not bending. Let us get into it. Wall Street is hiding a $3 trillion time bomb. All right, I need to talk about something that is happening right now on Wall Street that almost nobody outside of finance is paying attention to, and I guarantee you by the time I'm done explaining this, you are going to see the entire economy differently. There is a $3 trillion industry called private credit, and it is imploding in slow motion right in front of us. And here's why you should care, even if you've never heard that term in your life. Private credit is basically a bank that doesn't call itself a bank. After the 2008 crash, the government put all these regulations on traditional banks so they couldn't make the same reckless loans that blew up the economy. Smart, right? But here's the thing. The demand for those loans didn't disappear. It just moved. It moved to companies like BlackRock, Blackstone, Apollo, Blue Owl, Ares. These companies started lending money to businesses the same way banks used to, except with no regulation, no public disclosures, and no transparency. They call it shadow banking, and for a reason. Nobody can see what's happening inside these firms. And for years it worked great, because interest rates were basically zero and the economy was booming. But then rates went up, and the businesses that borrowed all that cheap money during the pandemic couldn't afford to pay it back anymore. As of this week, the default rate on private credit loans has surged to over 9%. That might not sound dramatic, but let me put it in perspective. In 2008, the entire housing market collapsed at an 8% default rate. We are past that number right now in private credit, and it's not slowing down. UBS, the giant Swiss bank, is estimating the default rate could hit 15%. Morgan Stanley warned it could reach 8% across direct lending alone, well above the historical average of 2 to 2.5%. Apollo is already reporting defaults above 11%. And here is the part that should genuinely scare you. These companies aren't just losing money on bad loans. They've been packaging those loans into something called CLOs, collateralized loan obligations, which is basically the same thing as the collateralized debt obligations that blew up in 2008, except they changed the name so you wouldn't notice. And they've been selling those CLOs to each other. BlackRock sells to Apollo. Apollo sells back to BlackRock. And then they insure those same loans through insurance companies that they own. So you've got the same company making the loan, packaging the loan, selling the loan, and insuring the loan. And when the loans fail, the insurance company that's supposed to pay out doesn't have the money because it's owned by the same firm that made the bad loan in the first place. Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, said it best last fall. He said, "When you see one cockroach, there are probably more." And the cockroaches are everywhere now. This week, Blackstone, Ares, and Apollo all restricted investor withdrawals, which means the people who put money into these funds are now being told you can't have it back. Blue Owl's stock has dropped 40% since January, and $265 billion in market value has already been wiped out across these firms. Jeffrey Gundlach, one of the most respected bond investors in the world, has said publicly that private credit will be the cause of the next financial crisis. And here is the part that connects directly to your life. Your 401k, your pension, your retirement account, there is a very high chance it has exposure to private credit through broad index funds, and you don't even know it. This is not 2008, but the architecture of this crisis is rhyming with 2008 in ways that should make everybody very uncomfortable. The oil cliff is coming and nobody can stop it. Now I need to connect what's happening on Wall Street to what's happening in the Middle East, because these two things are not separate stories. They are the same story and almost nobody is putting them together. Right now, the Strait of Hormuz, which is a narrow waterway off the coast of Iran, is effectively closed. 20% of the entire world's oil supply passes through that strait every single day. And since the war started on February 28th, Iran has made it very clear that nothing is getting through. The IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guard, has said publicly that not a single liter of oil will pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and that any vessel linked to the United States, Israel, or their allies will be treated as a legitimate target. They have attacked civilian ships. They've hit energy infrastructure. They've caused fuel shortages in Thailand, flight cancellations from Vietnam to New Zealand, and fuel rationing in Pakistan. Countries in Asia are already hoarding oil. China has curbed exports. South Korea just announced a 5-month restriction on NAFTA exports. Asian demand has already dropped by 2 million barrels a day just this month. And here is where it gets genuinely terrifying. Bloomberg talked to more than 3 dozen oil traders, executives, brokers, and shippers last week, and the message was unanimous. The world has not grasped the severity of what is happening. Oil futures are sitting around $116 a barrel right now, up 60% since the war started, but still well below the worst-case scenarios. And the reason prices haven't exploded yet is because of temporary buffers. Oil that was already in transit when the strait closed has reached port. The IEA coordinated the largest emergency reserve release in history, 400 million barrels. The U.S. temporarily lifted sanctions on some Russian and Iranian oil, but those buffers are running out. Every single one of them. A geopolitical strategist at BCA Research just laid it out in a research note that should be required reading for every American. Right now, the world has lost 4.5 to 5 million barrels per day because of this war. By mid-April, that number doubles. He called it an oil cliff. And once we go over it, the strategic reserves are gone, the rerouted oil is gone, and the exemptions are gone. Macquarie, the financial services firm, put 40% odds on oil hitting $200 a barrel if this war drags into June. The head of Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy said there is no policy option to prevent oil prices from marching toward $200 if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed. It is too large an amount of supply, and here is what $200 oil actually means for your life. Gasoline goes to $7 or $8 a gallon. Diesel goes even higher, which means everything that moves on a truck, which is everything you buy, gets dramatically more expensive. Airlines start canceling routes. Manufacturers shut production lines. Small businesses that were already on the edge go under. The cost of food, which is already up 25% since 2020, takes another massive leg up because of fertilizer costs, diesel costs, and supply chain disruptions that haven't even started yet. Goldman Sachs already estimated that the oil shock will shave GDP growth, push inflation higher, and make it nearly impossible for the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates, which is the one thing that could help save the private credit industry we just talked about. So you've got Wall Street cracking on one side and an energy crisis building on the other. And the thing that could help one problem makes the other one worse. That is the trap. And nobody in Washington, nobody on cable news, and nobody on your social media feed is explaining it to you that clearly, mid-April is the cliff, and we are 2 weeks away. One paycheck was never supposed to be a fantasy. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it for a second. When was the exact moment that working one full-time job stopped being enough to survive in this country? Because it happened. It happened and nobody held a press conference about it. Nobody passed a resolution. Nobody stood at a podium and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, effective immediately, one job will no longer cover your bills." It just became the new normal, and we all adjusted like it was weather. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 8.8 million Americans were officially holding more than one job as of late 2025, up from 8.4 million the year before. But that official number is a joke, and everybody who studies this knows it. A PMNTS intelligence report from early 2026 found that 4 in 10 American consumers now earn additional income through side jobs. 4 in 10. ZipRecruiter's January 2026 survey of 1,500 workers found that 35% currently have a side hustle or hold multiple jobs. Side Hustle Nation puts it at 39% of the entire working population, which amounts to roughly 80 million people. And here is the detail that should make you stop scrolling. Among millennials, that number is 50%. Half of an entire generation is working more than one job. Not because they are ambitious, not because they are building an empire, because rent is due and one paycheck does not cover it anymore. A Lending Tree survey found that the majority of side hustlers say they could not afford to live without their supplemental income. And 42% of people earning less than $50,000 a year said they use their side gig money for basic living expenses, not vacations, not investments, groceries, utilities, gas to get to the first job. And here is the part that really gets under my skin. A monster poll of over 1,200 workers found that 95% say their income has not kept pace with the cost of living. 95%. That is not a statistic. That is a consensus. That is an entire workforce raising its hand and saying this is not working. And instead of anyone in a position of power addressing that, instead of any meaningful policy response, we invented a word for it. We call it polyworking now. We put a trendy label on economic desperation and made it sound like a lifestyle choice. Monster found that 47% of workers are already doing it, and nearly 60% are open to doing it. And the framing is always about flexibility and entrepreneurial spirit, as if people are choosing this instead of being shoved into it by an economy that has made single-income survival a mathematical impossibility for tens of millions of households. A financial expert named Stoy Hall, who runs a wealth management firm in Iowa, said the most significant and overlooked risk of all this is burnout. He said something that stayed with me. He asked, is it a side gig because you just need extra money, and it is something simple? Well, that is fine, but it is dragging you away from other things in life, other memories, your relationships, even more time in your actual 9-to-5 that maybe could give you more money. And that right there is the trap. You are too busy working your second job to fight for better pay at your first one. But the most damning number in all of this is one that ZipRecruiter uncovered and nobody is talking about. Workers earning over $150,000 a year are the most likely group to have a side hustle at 44.8%, more than people earning under $25,000, more than people earning $25,000 to $50,000. The highest earners in the country are moonlighting at higher rates than the poorest. And you know why? Because even at $150,000 a year, In a country where a median home costs over $400,000 and daycare runs $1,300 to $4,000 a month, and health insurance premiums eat another $500 to $800, even that salary does not provide the security it is supposed to. Even the people we would call successful are hedging. They are building escape routes. They are acting like people who do not trust the system to hold. And when 6 in 10 consumers are earning their primary income outside of fixed salaries, according to PYMNTS intelligence, when the very concept of a stable paycheck is becoming a minority experience, what you are looking at is not a labor market. It is a survival market. Your grandparents worked one job and built a life. You work 2 or 3 and build a schedule. That is not an economy. That is a sign that the entire economic model this country was built on has quietly failed, and we are all just too busy working to notice. America has turned its back on its own children. I am going to tell you something right now that should disqualify every single person in Congress from ever using the phrase pro-family again. In 2021, the United States government expanded the child tax credit. They made it fully refundable. They boosted it from $2,000 per child to $3,000 and $3,600 for children under 6. They let families take it in monthly installments instead of waiting for a lump sum at tax time. And you know what happened? Child poverty in America was cut in half. It fell to its lowest level ever recorded, 5.2%. That is not an estimate. That is Census Bureau data. We proved with receipts that we could dramatically reduce the number of children going hungry, going without heat, going without shoes that fit, going without the basic dignity that every child in the richest country on earth is supposed to have. We proved it worked. And then Congress let it expire. And child poverty surged right back up. From 5% in 2021 to 13% by 2024. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities called it the direct result of policy choices, not an act of God, not an economic downturn, a choice, a deliberate legislative decision to stop doing the thing that was working. And it gets worse. Because in 2025, Congress passed the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and buried inside that law is a version of the child tax credit that is designed, structurally, to send money upward instead of downward. The Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy analyzed it and found that 99% of children in the poorest fifth of American households will receive a reduced credit or no credit at all under the new law. Let me say that again because I need you to hear it. 99% of the poorest children in America are excluded from the benefit that is supposed to help children. Meanwhile, the largest share of child tax credit benefits under the new law, 41%, goes to the richest fifth of families. They increased the maximum credit from $2,000 to $2,200 and indexed it to inflation, which sounds nice until you realize they did absolutely nothing to fix the refundability restrictions that lock out the families who need it most. If your family earns too little, which is the exact situation the credit is supposed to address, you get nothing. The new tax law literally redistributes child benefit money from the bottom to the top, and then the same Congress that passed that law cut SNAP. The OBBA slashed food assistance so deeply that Feeding America estimates it could take nearly 6 billion meals off the table for SNAP participants every year. Nationally, 2.4 million people could lose their benefits by 2034, with over 1 million facing the short-term risk of losing them in 2026 alone from expanded work requirements. Now layer the children's mental health crisis on top of that, and tell me this country has its priorities in order. Suicide is now the second leading cause of death for Americans aged 10 to 34. The CDC reports that 1 in 5 high school students seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year. 40% of high school students report persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. The suicide rate among young people aged 10 to 24 increased 62% from 2007 to 2021. Among black youth aged 10 to 17, it increased 144%. Research released in 2025 found that suicide is rising dramatically in children as young as 8 years old, with an 8.2% annual increase from 2008 to 2022. 1 in 3 young adults between 18 and 25 experienced a mental, behavioral, or emotional health issue in the past year, up from roughly 1 in 5 in 2016. And while all of this is happening, the administration discontinued the LGBTQ+ 988 crisis line and is advancing policies projected to strip Medicaid coverage from over 10 million people by 2034, which directly reduces access to the mental health services these children desperately need. A country that had the solution to child poverty in its hands, watched it work, measured its success, and then deliberately chose to take it away, is not a country investing in its future. It is a country consuming its future. And the children are paying for it with their health, their hunger, and if you are a gig worker or a freelancer, you pay both sides of that Social Security and Medicare tax, the full 15.3%, because there is no employer splitting it with you, and that is just what comes off the top. That is just the first cut. Then you take what is left and you go spend it. And the sales tax takes another bite, anywhere from nothing in a few states to over 9% combined state and local in places like Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Then your property tax takes a bite, and WalletHub's 2026 analysis found that Vermont residents pay 4.9% of their income in property taxes alone. Then your gas tax takes a bite. Then your cell phone bill has federal and state surcharges buried in it. Then your utility bills have fees and levies tacked on. Then the registration on your car. Then the tolls on your commute. Then the taxes on the insurance you are required by law to carry. And when you add it all up, the Tax Foundation, WalletHub, and multiple independent analyses all arrive at roughly the same conclusion. The average American household is paying somewhere between 25 and 35% of its total income in combined federal, state, and local taxes, depending on where they live. Hawaii takes 13.3% just at the state level. In high-tax states, the effective total burden can approach 40% or more. The first 3 to 4 months of every year, you are working entirely to pay the government. Every dollar you earn from January through sometime in March or April, depending on your state, goes to taxes before you start earning for yourself. And the question that nobody in power wants you to ask is, what are you getting for it? Your roads are crumbling. The American Society of Civil Engineers has been grading the country's infrastructure, and it has not earned above a C- in decades. Your public schools are losing teachers at record rates because the profession does not pay enough to live in the communities they serve. Social Security, the thing you pay into every single paycheck, is projected to be insolvent within a decade. Your healthcare system bankrupts families. Medical debt is the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in this country. And the military budget, which consumes the single largest discretionary spending category, sits at $886 billion and climbing. But here is the detail that turns frustration into fury. Under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the 2017 tax cuts were made permanent. And the distribution of those cuts tells you everything you need to know about who this system actually serves. The Food Research and Action Center and Americans for Tax Fairness found that almost 3/4 of the tax cuts go to the highest income 20% of households. The top 1% will enjoy a windfall of over $1 trillion over the next decade. And the tax provisions benefiting those with incomes over $500,000 will cost the federal government $1.5 trillion, which is nearly identical to the size and scope of the cuts to SNAP and Medicaid. One analysis found that the law will reduce income for the poorest 20% of Americans by an average of 3.8%, while increasing income for the wealthiest 20% by 3.7%. That is a 7.5 percentage point gap, and it is not fiscal discipline, it is a transfer. You are taxed at every level of earning and spending. That tax money goes to a government that is tens of trillions in debt and spending a growing share of your contributions on interest payments to bondholders. The richest people in the country pay a shrinking share of their wealth in taxes. They use the savings to buy political influence. That influence produces tax laws that benefit them even further. And the infrastructure, the schools, the safety net programs, and the services that your taxes were supposed to fund deteriorate because the money is going to debt service and upward redistribution instead. That is not a tax system. That is a wealth extraction pipeline disguised as civic duty. And the fact that most Americans accept it as normal is the clearest sign that the collapse is already so advanced we cannot even see it anymore. We just call it April. Having a roof over your head is becoming a luxury in the richest country on earth. I want you to really think about this number. Fannie Mae ran the math in early 2026 and found that to restore housing affordability to where it was between 2016 and 2019, which was not even a golden era, that was already a stretch for most people. One of three things would have to happen. Either median home prices would have to fall 38% to about $257,000, or median household income would have to rise more than 60% to about $134,500. Or mortgage rates would have to fall to 2.35%. As of right now, not a single one of those things is remotely on the horizon. Home prices are not falling, incomes are not surging, and the Federal Reserve is nowhere near cutting rates to that level. The median home price in America is now over $400,000. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce reports that as of January 2026, the average home value sits at $357,445, up nearly 33% over the past 5 years. On the West Coast and in parts of Florida, buying a home now costs 8 years of the median salary. 8 years. The Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies found that monthly mortgage payments on the median-priced home rose to $2,570 under terms typical to first-time buyers, which is a record, and it is 40% higher than it was in 1990 adjusted for inflation. To afford that payment plus taxes and insurance, a buyer would need an annual income of at least $126,700. The median household income in America is roughly $80,000. So the average American family cannot afford the average American home. That sentence should be tattooed on the forehead of every politician who claims the economy is doing well. And renting is not the escape hatch that it used to be. Since 2020, the national average rent is 27% higher. In Miami, it is up 51%. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition reports that there is no state, no county, and no city in this entire country where a person working full-time at minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. Not one. A minimum wage worker would have to clock 86 hours a week just to afford a 1-bedroom. That is not a housing market. That is a hostage situation. And the numbers behind that are even more brutal when you look at what it does to families. In 2021, more than 42 million American households were cost-burdened, meaning they were spending more than 30% of their income on housing. That number has only grown since. 70% of all extremely low-income renters are severely cost-burdened, paying more than half their income just to keep a roof over their heads. Half. That means every other dollar goes to the landlord, and what is left has to cover food, transportation, healthcare, childcare, and everything else a family needs to survive. And the affordable housing shortage is not a mystery. For every 100 extremely low-income renter households in this country, only 35 affordable and available rental homes exist. 35 for every 100. Year after year, that number stays the same or gets worse, because the development and preservation of affordable housing has not kept up with demand. And when people cannot afford to be housed, they end up without housing. In January 2024, fully 771,480 people were counted as homeless on a single night in America. That is a 33% increase since January 2020, an 18% jump in just 1 year. The United States Interagency Council on Homelessness reports that as many as 40 to 60% of people experiencing homelessness actually have a job. They are working, and they are still homeless, because wages have not kept up with rents. And what did Congress do in response? They passed a law that slashes Medicaid by $863 billion and SNAP by $295 billion, which are the exact programs that prevent people on the edge from falling into homelessness. Home builders estimate that the tariffs imposed on construction materials will add $10,900 to the price of every new home. Reduced immigration is shrinking the already thin construction labor pool, and the IIJA infrastructure authorizations expire in 2026, meaning the modest momentum we had is about to hit a cliff. Redfin's economists coined the phrase the Great Housing Reset and estimated it will take approximately 5 years from now for the market to return to a semblance of normal affordability, and that assumes sustained political will, continued zoning reform, and an economy that does not slide into recession. None of which is guaranteed. The American dream used to include a home. Now the dream is just finding an apartment you can afford without skipping meals. And for 771,000 people counted on one night in January, even that dream is gone. The country is physically falling apart and nobody is fixing it fast enough. You do not need a government report to know that this country is falling apart. You can feel it in your tires. You can see it in the orange water that comes out of the tap in some cities. You can hear it in the news every time a bridge collapses or a water main breaks or a school closes because the building is not safe for children to sit in. But the government report exists, and it confirms everything your eyes are already telling you. The American Society of Civil Engineers releases an infrastructure report card every 4 years, grading the nation's physical systems the same way a teacher grades a student. In 2025, the United States received an overall grade of C. Now that might sound like an improvement, and technically it is, up from a C- in 2021 and a D+ before that. But 9 of the 18 graded categories still received a D or D+. Roads got a D+, transit got a D, stormwater got a D, aviation got a D+, schools got a D+, energy got a D+, drinking water, the stuff that comes out of your faucet, got a C-, and the ASSE's own executive described the situation not as a midlife crisis but an old age crisis, saying everything is coming due at the same time. The estimated investment gap to bring the nation's infrastructure into a state of good repair over the next decade is $3.7 trillion. Even after the $1.2 trillion Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the largest federal investment in infrastructure in American history, the gap is still staggering. And here is the part that should terrify you. The authorizations under that law expire in 2026, the money runs out, and Congress has not signaled any commitment to continuing it at those levels. And the problem is not just that the money runs out, the problem is time. Infrastructure projects take years from planning to completion. The IJA money started flowing about 3 years ago, and the engineers who study this say that is simply not enough time to make a dent in systems that have been neglected for 50 years. 37% of roads eligible for federal funds are in poor condition. The rate of improvement for repairing bridges in poor condition has drastically slowed in recent years, even as the number classified as fair, which means one step away from poor, has skyrocketed. The ASE estimates that crumbling infrastructure costs every American household $3,300 a year in hidden costs, from lost time sitting in traffic, to extra car repairs from pothole damage, to higher fuel consumption from congested roads. That is $3,300 that comes out of your pocket every year, because the country will not fix its own roads, and extreme weather is making all of it worse. Climate-driven events caused more than $180 billion in damage in 2024 alone, and the ASE notes that aging systems are increasingly vulnerable to catastrophic failure during these events. The power grid, which received a D+ in 2025, is the one that keeps me up at night. We saw what happened in Texas. We saw what happened in North Carolina during Tropical Storm Helene. When the grid goes down in a modern society, everything stops. Hospitals run on generators, water treatment plants fail, traffic lights go dark, supply chains freeze, and the people who suffer most are always the ones who can least afford a backup plan. But here is what really exposes the collapse. A National League of Cities report surveyed over 200 municipal leaders across the country and found that the results were strikingly consistent year after year. Leaders desperately want to invest in their infrastructure. They know their water systems are failing. They know their roads are crumbling. They know their bridges are deteriorating. And they do not have the money to do it. Over 71% said water and wastewater systems were their highest priority, and 63% said roads and bridges were urgent. But many of these municipalities have staffs of 5 people. The director of research at the National League of Cities said the needle has barely moved in 3 years of surveying. And a professor at Penn State who specializes in water infrastructure said the findings were not a surprise. She said we need to address these issues before we experience another crisis like Flint, Michigan. But Flint was nearly a decade ago, and cities across America are still dealing with contaminated water, lead pipes, and wastewater systems built before their grandparents were born. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was a start. But a start is not a solution. And when the money runs dry in 2026, and the political will evaporates, and the next Congress decides that tax cuts for billionaires are more urgent than clean drinking water for children, the infrastructure grade will start sliding back toward the D range where it sat for 20 years. And every pothole, every burst pipe, every bridge closure, every boil water advisory will be a reminder that this country chose to let itself fall apart. Nobody trusts anything anymore, and that is the most dangerous collapse of all. Everything I have talked about in this video, every crisis, every system failure, every collapsing institution, all of it could theoretically be fixed. We could build more housing, we could repair the roads, we could fund the schools, we could expand the safety net, we could restructure the tax code. We have the resources, we have the knowledge, we have the engineers, the economists, the data scientists, and the policy experts who know exactly what to do. The reason none of it gets done is the subject of this section. And it might be the most important thing I say in this entire video. Nobody trusts anyone anymore. And without trust, this is not about who is in charge. This is about the fact that the American people, regardless of political affiliation, have collectively concluded that their government is not working for them. And it goes beyond the government. Gallup reported in 2025 that just 27% of Americans expressed confidence in their institutions overall, the lowest level since they started asking the question over 50 years ago. Only 3 institutions out of 18 measured earned majority confidence. 3. Small business, the military, and science. That is it. Congress, the institution that writes the laws and controls the money, received confidence from roughly 10% of the population. Television, one of the primary ways Americans receive information, received about the same. Trust in the news media hit a record low of 28%, the first time it has ever fallen below 30 in the history of the question. Among Republicans, confidence in media reporting is now in single digits at 8%. Among younger Democrats, the group you would expect to be most engaged with institutional media, trust is slipping below 40%. Even the Supreme Court has seen record low favorability. The church, which once served as one of the primary sources of community trust and social cohesion in American life, has seen confidence erode dramatically over the past 20 years, according to Gallup's tracking. And it is not just institutions. Pew found that Americans are losing trust in each other. People with lower levels of social trust tend to express less confidence in news organizations, schools, police, and the government. It creates what researchers describe as a vicious cycle. You stop trusting your neighbor. You stop trusting the system. You stop participating. The system deteriorates, trust erodes further, and the spiral deepens. And here is why this is the most dangerous collapse of all. More dangerous than the housing crisis, more dangerous than the infrastructure decay, more dangerous than the tax redistribution or the child poverty reversal or any of the other things we have covered. Because trust is the operating system. Trust is what allows a society to solve problems collectively. Democracy requires that you believe the process is legitimate even when you lose. Markets require that you believe contracts will be honored and debts will be repaid. Civic life requires that you believe your neighbor is acting in good faith. And when all of that breaks down, when 2/3 of the country says the government is not responding to the needs of ordinary people, when majorities say the system unfairly benefits some people over others, when less than 3 in 10 people believe the media is reporting the news accurately, what you are left with is not a disagreement. It is not a political divide. It is a legitimacy crisis, and a legitimacy crisis is the thing that comes before everything else falls apart. You cannot fix infrastructure if you cannot pass a budget. You cannot pass a budget if the people do not believe the government will spend the money honestly. You cannot build affordable housing if communities do not trust the institutions managing the development. You cannot even have a productive national conversation about any of it when more than half the population believes the information they are receiving is unreliable. The Pew Charitable Trusts put it plainly. If mistrust were a disease, the United States would be facing an epidemic, but nobody calls it a collapse because it does not look like a building falling. It looks like a country slowly forgetting how to work together, and by the time you notice, the damage is already structural. The country is $39 trillion in debt, and nobody has a plan. On March 17, 2026, the gross national debt of the United States crossed $39 trillion for the first time. I want you to understand how fast that happened. The debt was $34.5 trillion on March 15, 2024. That is $4.5 trillion added in just 2 years, not during a world war, not during a financial collapse, not during an emergency stimulus, during normal operations. The country is borrowing $7 billion a day. Every single day. The most recent trillion was added in less than 5 months. And the Peterson Foundation, one of the most respected fiscal watchdog organizations in the country, projects the debt will hit $40 trillion before the end of this calendar year. For perspective, the United States is not projected to reach $40 trillion in annual GDP until 2032, which means the country will owe more than its entire economy produces, and it is not even close. The Congressional Budget Office projects that debt held by the public will rise from about 100% of GDP today to 120% by 2036, shattering the record set after World War II. And by 2056, it climbs to 175%. 175% of everything the entire American economy generates. And if you think that is the real number, Kent Smetters, the faculty director of the Penn-Wharton budget model and one of the most respected fiscal economists in the country, says the real tab is not $39 trillion. It is closer to $100 trillion. Because when you account for the implicit liabilities buried in Social Security, Medicare, and other long-term obligations that the government is legally or morally committed to paying, the actual fiscal gap is nearly 3 times what the official number shows. The Penn-Wharton model has estimated that without major policy changes, U.S. Treasury debt will become unable to roll over its accumulated obligations within roughly 20 years. That is not a projection from a conspiracy theorist. That is from the University of Pennsylvania. And here is where it stops being abstract and starts being personal. The Congressional Budget Office projects that net interest payments on the national debt will exceed $1 trillion in fiscal year 2026. $1 trillion just in interest. Not paying down the debt, not funding programs, not building anything, just servicing the interest on money that has already been spent. That is nearly triple the $345 billion in interest the government paid in 2020. In the first 3 months of this fiscal year alone, interest payments reached $270 billion, which already surpasses what the country spent on national defense in the same period. Let me say that again. We are now paying more to service our debt than we are paying to defend the country, and it breaks down to $7,700 per American household per year. You are paying $7,700 a year just to cover the interest on Washington's credit card, and you are getting nothing for it. No roads, no schools, no health care, no security, just interest. And the CBO project's deficits will hit $1.9 trillion this year and balloon to $3.1 trillion by 2036. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget looked at all of it and used one word to describe the trajectory: unsustainable. Not concerning, not worrisome, unsustainable. And 2 days ago, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell stood in front of 400 Harvard students and said it himself. He said the level of debt is not unsustainable, but the path is not sustainable. He said it will not end well if we do not do something fairly soon. The chairman of the Federal Reserve is standing in a college classroom telling students that the fiscal trajectory of their country will not end well, and nobody in Congress is doing anything about it. And here is why this matters to you personally, even if you never think about the national debt. The more than $31 trillion in public debt competes with household and business loans in borrowing markets. It pushes interest rates up for everyone. The effect of today's swollen federal debt adds thousands of dollars of interest costs per year to a typical mortgage. It is a drag on economic growth, which means slower wage growth and fewer jobs, and it is consuming the budget from the inside. Every dollar that goes to interest is a dollar that does not go to infrastructure, education, healthcare, or the safety net. The OBBA, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that Congress passed in 2025, will add $4.7 trillion more to the debt through 2035 when you account for interest and economic effects. The CBO says it will produce a temporary economic sugar high, with GDP surging 2.2% in 2026 before settling into a sustained rate of 1.8%. A sugar high, that is the CBO's language. And the sugar high comes at the cost of higher interest rates, with the 10-year Treasury yield projected to climb from 4.1% this year to 4.4% by 2031, driven in large part by the government's insatiable need to borrow capital. Bridgewater's Ray Dalio has described one possible endgame as an economic heart attack, with government investment crowded out by debt service obligations. And the Highway Trust Fund is projected to run out of money by 2028. And the Social Security Trust Fund is projected to reach insolvency by 2032, at which point federal law mandates an immediate 24% across-the-board benefit cut for every retiree in America. Not a negotiation, not a vote, an automatic cut, written into law, triggered the moment the money runs out. That is not a theory. That is the current legal trajectory of the United States of America. And nobody in a position of power is treating it like an emergency. Because admitting it is an emergency would require doing something about it, and doing something about it would require telling voters the truth. And nobody wants to do that. The retirement you were promised does not exist anymore. Everything I have said in this video has been building to this: every failing system, every crumbling institution, every rigged tax code, every collapsing safety net, every broken promise from every politician who ever stood at a podium and told you that if you work hard and play by the rules, you will be okay. It all converges here, because the final sign of collapse, the one that will touch more lives than any other, is this. The retirement that your parents had, the retirement that was promised to you, the retirement that you have been working toward your entire adult life, does not exist anymore. The National Institute on Retirement Security released a report in February 2026 using U.S. Census Bureau data, and the finding was devastating. The typical working American has less than $1,000 saved for retirement. Less than $1,000, that is not a typo. That is not the bottom 10%. That is the typical worker, the median. And the National Council on Aging found that 80% of households with older adults, 47 million of them, are either financially struggling right now or are at risk of falling into economic insecurity. 80%. And among adults in the lowest 20% of income, older Americans die 9 years earlier than their wealthier peers. Not 9 months. 9 years. Poverty is not just taking their savings, it is taking their lives, and the program that was supposed to prevent all of this, the one program that 40% of older Americans say they plan to rely on as their only source of retirement income, is 6 years away from running out of money. Social Security's Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund is now projected by the Congressional Budget Office to reach insolvency by 2032, When that happens, the law requires an immediate 24% across-the-board benefit cut for every recipient, including people who are already retired, including people who have no other income, including people who chose not to save because the government told them Social Security would be there. The average retired worker receives $2,071 per month in 2026, which amounts to $24,852 a year. A 24% cut drops that to roughly $18,900. For millions of seniors who are already choosing between medication and food, between heating and eating, that cut would be a death sentence delivered by spreadsheet. The CRFB estimates that for a typical dual-income couple retiring shortly after the trust fund runs out, the annual loss would be $18,400. And the high-cost projection scenario, which assumes slower economic growth and more rapid mortality improvement, pushes the depletion date to as early as 2031. Next year. Not a generation from now, not your grandchildren's problem, yours. And the One Big Beautiful Bill Act made it worse. The Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget found that the legislation will starve the trust fund of revenue it usually receives from the taxation of benefits, accelerating the insolvency timeline. And here is the part that will haunt you if you let it. The number of Americans aged 65 and older has surged from 43 million in 2010 to 68 million in 2025. That is 25 million more people drawing on a system that is already insolvent on paper, funded by a shrinking, more debt-burdened workforce that has been stripped of pensions, saddled with student loans, priced out of homeownership, and left with 401k plans that were never designed to be the primary retirement vehicle for an entire nation. The baby boom generation holds over $85 trillion in assets, more than 50% of all U.S. wealth, despite making up less than 20% of the population. And the Wharton School found that Social Security has been the single most important tool for keeping wealth inequality from spiraling even further. Without it, 16 million Americans over 65 would fall below the poverty line. 16 million, and the payroll tax that funds Social Security only applies to earned income up to $184,500 in 2026. Every dollar above that line is exempt. Which means a hedge fund manager making $50 million a year pays the same Social Security tax as a school principal making $184,500. And 77% of seniors across both parties support eliminating that cap, which the Social Security Administration's own chief actuary says would extend solvency by 68 years through 2090. One policy change, one fix, supported by 3/4 of the people it affects, and Congress will not do it. Because the people who benefit from that cap are the same people who fund the campaigns of the people who could change it. That is not a conspiracy. That is the architecture of a system that is decided through its design, if not its language, that some retirements matter and others do not. And if you are watching this video right now, yours probably does not. I did not make this video to scare you. I made it because you have a right to know what is happening. Because the institutions that are supposed to keep you informed have either stopped paying attention or stopped telling the truth. And the only thing more dangerous than a collapse is a collapse that nobody sees coming. But here is the thing. You see it now. And that puts you ahead, not ahead of the curve, ahead of the people who are still pretending. If you know Social Security is 6 years from insolvency, you do not wait until you are 62 to make a plan. You start now. If you know your job is not secure, you build a skill that travels with you. If you know the tax system is designed to move wealth upward, you stop waiting for it to be fixed, and you learn how to protect what you have. If you know your city's water system is graded a D+, you do not assume someone else is going to fix it. You get a filter. You show up at the city council meeting. You make noise. If you know housing is going to stay unaffordable for at least 5 more years, you adjust your plan now, not when you are priced out permanently. Information is not power until you act on it. And acting on it is how you protect the people who depend on you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Not to frighten them, to arm them. Because the signs of collapse are everywhere. But so are the people who refuse to go down without a fight. Take care of yourselves. Take care of your families. And I will catch you in the next one.